And we listen to that a lot. Anyway, we're here in part to look at the meaning of kindness. And what that means in our lives, what that means coming from God. Julio Diaz is a social worker in the Bronx, and a number of years ago, he was on his way home in the wintertime. It was cold out, and he was on his way home when a kid came up to him with a knife and said, "Give me all your money." Well, he didn't feel like his money or his wallet was worth losing his life over, so he gave the kid his money, and as the kid was running off, he looks at him and goes, "That kid doesn't have a coat." And so he yells after him. He says, "Hey, kid, if you're going to continue robbing people all night, you're going to need a coat. Come back and get this. I'll give you my coat." So the kid stops. Says, "Okay." Comes back, gets the coat. And Julio says, "Hey, you look a little hungry. Why don't we go down here? My favorite diner is right down here, and we'll go have some supper." The kid goes, "Okay." "Why are you doing this? Don't you know what it means to have someone show you any kindness?" He goes, "No." He says, "Well, come on, we'll go talk, and we'll go down to the diner and have some supper." So they go down to the diner and have some supper, and after supper, Julio looks at him and says, "Hey, listen, if you want me to pay, I've got to have my wallet back. And while you're at it, why don't you give me the knife, too?" So I don't know what happened to the coat. His mother actually says about Julio that if someone asks Julio for the time, he'll give them his watch. He's just that kind of person. Kindness runs in his genes, and he wants to be kind to people. God wants to be kind to you. And he shows us through David that kindness is who he is and what he wants to do in this world. The first chapter that we're looking at today has very little to do with kindness, but it has everything to do with God's blessing. God is blessing David on every side. God is helping David in every endeavor that he has, and so we'll be looking at some military victories that David goes through. We get this list of military victories not only from the Scriptures, but there are lists in the ancient Near East of kings who have conquered their enemies, and they list them down. And so whoever wrote the book of Samuel probably went and looked at the list of nations that David had conquered and said, "This is what God has done for David." This is what we do in our life to show great victories. It says Steve Carlton on there. And we save baseballs and we save mementos of great victories in our life. David's reign fulfilled the promises of God to him. But they weren't a total fulfillment of all the promises that God had given him. And this is something that, as we look through this, we need to understand. That God has promised us a great home. But that home is not limited to the house that you live here on earth. There is also the greater fulfillment that we will have in heaven. God has promised us new life, life in the resurrection. And some of us are enjoying very good health, but really even that doesn't compare to the life that we will have when we get to heaven. God has promised us great things. We see those promises in part fulfilled today and in part fulfilled through David's victories, but their fulfillment will come when Jesus Christ comes riding in on his white horse and says, all of the evil in the world is done. And so these are partial fulfillments of what God is doing in the world, and they will completely be fulfilled when Jesus Christ comes again. And so we start here in chapter 8 with this catalog of these defeated nations. God was with David. We've seen it over and over and over and over again. And we need to have that firmly ingrained in our minds. That God wanted to be with Israel, and he wants to be with Israel's king. Jesus Christ's name is Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us, and he wants to be part of our life. And he was with David. We have to explore what that means, because if we think that it means continual victory in our life, we will be sorely mistaken. David never was. It says that the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. A refrain that we see in chapter 8. He had victory over the Philistines, who were occupying the flat part of this map on the western side of this map. He gave him victory over those people. He gave him victory in the valley of Rephaim, where he had some wonderful victories. He had some more victories over the people of Moab, over there on the right side of the map, as he went after those folks. And then he took on the Ammonites. Now the Ammonites are in that little country in the middle with the blue. And they went and made a treaty with the Arameans, who run that big country up there in the north. At this time in world history, the Egyptians were in chaos and weren't able to do anything. And so they had left the whole Middle East alone. The Syrians hadn't risen to power. The Babylonians hadn't risen to power. And so all of these little kingdoms said, hey, let's make a name for ourselves. So the Philistines were trying to make a name for themselves. The Arameans were trying to make a name for themselves. And David, with the Lord on his side, was given victory over all of these folks. Now, if you read through chapter 8, he does something very nasty to the people from Moab and to their horses. And maybe it isn't mean, but it sure sounds mean to me. And it's kind of hard to understand. I really don't have an explanation for why he's mean to these people, unless he actually thinks it's actually being nice to them. For all of us who have had knee surgery, this really strikes a note. It's surprising that he does this, unless it's not meanness, because his grandmother was a Moabite. You know, this is being mean to people that he should have loved, and it's kind of surprising, but it's passed over without much comment. It's just mentioned there about what David did to them. And then it talks about all the spoils of war that David collects. And he brings them all to Jerusalem. He brings them to God. Again, reminding us that David has got God with him in all of the things that he's doing. He brings them in, and he dedicates all of these things to God, and he consecrates them to God, and they are sanctified to God. Samuel is telling us that David was doing all of this because God was with him, and he was praising God and glorifying God because of it. It's not something that we should do. I don't think you should go rob a bank or conquer a nation or kill someone to get their money. But David was doing this as king over Israel. And then in the last part of chapter 8, we read about David's officials. And we see that David is moving from this kinship sort of government to a bureaucracy based on skill and ability. Skills are good to have. And the people that he put into his cabinet had good skills. They had skills in fighting, they had skills in writing, they had skills in diplomacy, they had skills in bureaucracy. We need more people who are skilled in bureaucracy. No, but we need them. And so we see that David is being blessed by God everywhere that he turns. And then there's a verse that says, David reigned over all of Israel, doing what was just and right for all of his people. And this is a big verse for us as well, because this is what God wants to do in our lives, and what all rulers should do in our lives. They should rule with justice and righteousness for all the people. David rules as God himself wants his people to be ruled. David is God's messenger on this earth, God's ambassador to this earth, to rule as God wants his people to be ruled. And so David is fulfilling all of these promises and showing us what the king should be like. And so we now have this complete picture of David's new kingdom. David is completely king. He is completely in charge. He is getting all these blessings from God, and he's doing and acting exactly how God wants him to behave. And after all of this, he's got some old business that he wants to attain to. This deal with Mike. He searches for a descendant of Saul. You know, new dynasties were not noted for their mercy. In fact, they were noted for killing off everybody that had any claim to any part of the throne. And this happens wherever you go. When you come into power, you try and get rid of those people that could depose you. And frankly, you know, in those days, they did it by murder. But Jonathan had made David a promise, a covenant. He had made a covenant with David. And Jonathan had said, do not ever cut off your kindness from my family. Not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth. Do not cut me off. Now, it's interesting that the word covenant and the word cut come from the same root. Covenants were made by